Irene Raymond wasn't looking for trouble. She'd been dealing with enough drama at the Queen Vic, the pub she co-owned with her husband, Terry. But in the sprawling, often chaotic, and close-knit community of Albert Square, it seemed trouble was always ready to find you, even when you weren't asking for it. At 50, she was finally starting to get things in order, especially after all of the heartache of raising her daughter, Sarah. She thought that was enough of a roller coaster for one lifetime, but then Troy Harvey walked into her life, and all bets were off. Troy, a guy with the kind of disarming smile that made even the most hardened hearts melt a little, was her son Tony's old school buddy, a kid she'd vaguely known years ago. He'd returned to Albert Square after a tour that took him across the country, only to find that his old friend had left the country. When she had offered Troy Tony's old room, it felt like an easy kindness to extend, something she was always known for. She never imagined that his presence would trigger a firestorm of emotions she thought she'd left behind with her youth. It all began so innocently, a casual conversation here, a shared cup of coffee there, but the tension between them quickly built, a slow burn that threatened to ignite into something intense, something forbidden. One evening, a typical London rain was falling heavily against the windows, the sound like a heartbeat against the glass, and Irene was in the living room, trying to unwind from a long day at the pub. She had just kicked up her worn but much-loved slippers and was finally starting to get her head straight when Troy appeared in the doorway. He'd just come back from work, his plaid shirt slightly damp with the mist of the rain. His eyes were wide with a need that matched her own, and in that moment, she found herself wanting him. Not in a motherly way, but as a woman. It was a desperate craving that had nothing to do with what was proper or even right. "You look like you had a long day," he'd said softly, and her heart began to race. He seemed like he was always close by, as if he was drawn to her, just as much as she was drawn to him. She'd had to push him away, with some lame excuse about her being tired, but she knew that she was fooling no one, especially herself. She could have chalked the encounter up to her lack of sleep and too much caffeine, but every time she would look at him, it would seem like her heart was going to crawl out of her throat. She couldn't shake the intense longing she felt, the electric pull she had for the younger man. It was both terrifying and intoxicating. The feelings only intensified, she was sure, when Troy started wearing his shirt unbuttoned, and she'd found herself sneaking looks of him while he moved about the house. He did it on purpose. She knew he did. And every time, a blush would creep across her face. She was becoming obsessed, and it was all her fault. Irene had always been a proper woman, but now, that facade was beginning to crack. She found herself going through old photo albums, remembering the times that she was young and carefree. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, and didn't know the older, more refined woman who stared back at her. All she could think of was how Troy looked at her, with passion and desire, something she hadn't felt in years. Her desire intensified even more as they were alone in the house. She could practically feel him, taste him. When Terry had left on a trip for work, she knew she was in trouble. Her daughter Sarah, however, was not oblivious to what was going on, and had started to become jealous of the unspoken tension she could sense between Irene and Troy. She'd always had a difficult time adjusting to their family, but things had turned up a notch lately, with Mark now also being part of the house dynamic. She tried flirting with him a few times, only for him to give her a half-hearted smile, or some comment that was completely off topic. She felt like she was invisible to the younger man, and the cruel rejection left her feeling like she was unwanted and heartbroken. "Why can't he see me?" Jezebel had muttered while applying her eyeliner, the thick black making her eyes look even darker. "Is there something wrong with me?" "Don't you say such things," Irene had said as she grabbed her daughter's hand. "You are perfect just as you are, sweetheart. He doesn't know what he's missing out on. That's his loss, not yours." Her words, as comforting as they had tried to be, had done nothing to ease Jezebel's broken spirit, as the teenager with a heart that was on her sleeve and an emotion that couldn't be denied had just scoffed, rolled her eyes, and buried herself under her covers, with her poodle, a giant cloud of fluff, at her side. While putting her daughter's clothes away, Irene couldn't help the strong feelings of remorse and guilt that began to bubble in her stomach, the need to protect her daughter from what she, a mother of a teenager, should have kept at bay. Irene decided to confront him, if only to tell him that he was causing too many problems in her home. When Mark answered the door, a strange calmness overtook her, making her realize that this was not what she was looking for. He was the boy next door, her son's friend, nothing more, but the longer she looked into his sad eyes, her anger faded away. It was like seeing a lost puppy, something she was never able to resist. Before she even realized it, she was caressing his cheek, her hand a delicate touch that she couldn't stop from making. And it was reciprocated by a hungry kiss, one that she knew she couldn't keep from returning. The kiss was sweet, but it was far too much, and it made her more terrified than she'd ever been before. They'd gone back to doing the dance they had perfected, one that made her look at herself and feel like she was both repulsive and absolutely beautiful. And both of those things were happening at the same time. She was lost. It was a dance with danger, one that they both understood they were playing, but the need for each other was too much to deny. Later, while alone in her bathroom, washing the blush away, she wondered, how could this have happened? She was a good person, a kind person, someone who would have done anything for anybody. And here she was, being a homewrecker to her own marriage while trying to protect her own daughter. It just wasn't right. Later that week, Troy, knowing he couldn't stay away, met her in the woods near their house. Their kiss was tender, and it was full of something that they both had known was coming. It wasn't passion, it was recognition, and it was one that she couldn't ignore. "What is this, Mark?" she had finally asked, her voice small. "What are we doing?" "I have no idea, Brenda," he'd confessed, his eyes full of so much need and wanting that it had brought a lump to her throat. "But I can't stop myself from wanting you." She knew she was walking on eggshells, and that one wrong step would not only hurt her, but her whole family as well. But she didn't care. However, their carefully constructed facade was about to come crashing down. One night, Jezebel walked in on them during a date night, her eyes full of questions and her face tight with anger. Brenda, caught red-handed, tried to do damage control, but it was too late. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, and all of her lies were starting to look very clear. "I am done," she told her when both women were finally alone. "I won't be chasing after some boy like a love-struck fool. I am done." Jezebel refused to look at her, tears streaming down her face. "You always look after everyone else, but it feels like you never see me," she confessed. "And to do that, with Mark? You know how much I care for him, Mom." Brenda had put her arm around her daughter, but she wouldn't stop crying, and the guilt had settled itself into her bones. She knew, then and there, that she needed to put an end to it, not just for her daughter, but also for herself. She had gone over to Mark's home, ready to put an end to all of it, when she'd been stopped at the door by his father. He'd confronted her about his son, saying that Mark had been neglecting his work for her and was now falling for her like a lovesick puppy. This had angered Brenda. It had set a fire in her blood that couldn't be denied. That night, she went to Mark, and she told him all about what his father had said. And as they began to argue about it, she began to yell. She didn't want to be a doormat. She didn't want to be some prize to win. She just wanted to be seen. Mark had responded by pulling her into a passionate kiss, and for just one moment, everything was right with the world. "Mark," she had whispered while clutching his face, "this isn't right. This has to end." "I don't want to stop," he'd admitted to her, and this time, she couldn't resist, falling hard and fast, despite every single one of her better judgments. Later that night, they had made love in his bed, and it felt like all the world had melted away, leaving just the two of them. In that moment, she felt happy, truly and deeply happy for the first time in a long time. But it was all fleeting. She knew she had to put an end to it before it destroyed everything she had built. A few days later, after Jezebel had threatened to move in with her ex-boyfriend, And after Brenda had nearly gotten run over in the road because of her stress, she'd gone over to Mark's, ready to make it all stop. Mark. She had confessed to him while she clung to his arms, begging him to understand. We can't keep doing this.
But I love you, Brenda, he had cried, tears streaming down his face, and her heart had just simply shattered. No, she said. No, you don't. You just don't. She had looked into his eyes, and she had seen both a frightened little boy and a young man who was lost and needed help. She couldn't do this to him, not again. But it was too late. She knew it too. Later, as she was getting ready for bed, putting on a new nightgown that she'd just bought for herself, she saw his face in the mirror, just as she saw herself. It was all wrong. It was all messy. But she couldn't help the feelings that she felt for the younger man. It was something that she couldn't deny. Then, after an awkward encounter with his father, she knew that this mess was about to spill out into everyone's lives, and that it was only a matter of time before someone was going to get hurt. This meant it was time to say goodbye for real. Brenda, after trying to convince herself that she was making the right decision, found herself meeting with Mark at a local coffee shop where he had been waiting for her. It was a bright, sunny day, but the heavy clouds in her heart made it feel like an eternity before she finally sat across from him. She told him it was over, and that they could no longer do this. "Why, Brenda? Why?" he had whispered, and his heartbreak had only fueled her sorrow. "Tell me, what have I done wrong?" "It's you, Mark. It's all you. You are too young and too pretty, and I am just not right for this," she'd confessed, her voice breaking apart with every syllable. "I can't do this anymore." He tried to convince her that he was serious, but she refused to hear it, as she didn't want him to see the cracks that had appeared on her carefully constructed facade. She just left, without so much as a backward glance, and she knew she had done it all, just to save herself. As she walked away, she'd felt hollow. She'd thought she had been doing the right thing, and now, all that was left was the emptiness that she could never fill. And then, the pieces all started to fall apart. Irene's guilt, her conflicting desires, and her desperate need to fix the situation drove her to take increasingly reckless steps, not caring for the consequences. She had told herself that what she was doing was for the good of others, especially her daughter, but what it all seemed to come down to was a deep-seated need to not be the doormat that her former husband had. The tension grew as she had a series of awkward encounters with her daughter, where she tried to explain. Jezebel, however, was not listening, as she felt as if her mother was not only a hypocrite, but also that she had betrayed her. When Terry, suspicious of Irene's recent behavior, began to make comments and then took off for work, it had felt like her world was about. With everything crashing down around her, Irene met with Mark. Finally, they spoke, they yelled, and finally, they kissed, for what she thought was. She needed him. She wanted him. She just couldn't keep. She saw him the following day, while she was at the supermarket, the local spot that they had agreed to be there. He looked at her as if she was a goddess, someone that he had to save, and she saw it all. She saw her desperation, her need, and all the cracks that had begun to form in her perfect facade, and she hated her. Then, she found a way to tell Jezebel what she had been going through, confessing all her lies. This, of course, had led to a big fight, one that had left her feeling as if she was going to suffocate from the sheer emotion. It had all just snowballed into something bigger and grander than she had ever met. After her daughter had moved out, tired of her antics, she was left alone. That's when Mark came back into her life. They were together again, but this time, the love they had shared was now muddied with lies and resentment, something she had hoped to. She decided to see it all through, however, and when Terry decided to take her on a trip to the Bahamas, she went with the intent of finally having a The trip, however, was anything but relaxing, as they barely spoke to one another. They were as strangers living in the same house, sharing the same bed, and she couldn't keep running away. She couldn't keep pretending. The end, however, came quickly. During their trip, Terry found a note, one written to Brenda from Mark. He confronted her about this, saying that he knew she had been lying to him and was now betraying him. His words stung, but she didn't try to deny them. She told him everything, about how she had been seeing Mark, how they had fallen in love, and what she had been hoping for with him. Terry, finally realizing that it wasn't all in his head, packed her bags and left her at the bus stop. It was here, on the side of the road, that Irene finally realized that she had been living in a fantasy. She'd imagined that everything she had been doing was for her own good, when all she had truly done was break the hearts of every single person who cared for her, especially her daughter, who had begged her not to see Mark again. She'd failed her, as a mother, as a woman, and as someone she had always meant to be. With no other option, Irene went to see Mark, telling him that this was the last time they would ever see each other. He tried to convince her to come back to him, to fight for the love they had built, but she wouldn't listen, as she was done. "We can't do this, Mark," she'd told him. "It's just not right." "But what about our love?" he cried, his eyes wet with tears. "Don't you love me?" Irene refused to answer, and in a moment that would live in infamy, Irene turned and walked away from him, never looking back. She was done with that life, and it was time for her to start a new one, even if that new one was on her own. This was her journey, and it had nothing to do with Mark, with his father, or with Terry. This was all about her, and she was finally ready to stop being a doormat and take control of her life. In the end, even with all of the mess and all of the heartbreak, there was always something to be learnt if you only were willing to see it, and this was it for her. The time had finally come to put herself first.